Rain poured in heavy sheets over the ruined compound, soaking through her clothes and matting her hair to her bloodied face. She was on her knees, trembling, her hands clenched tightly around something no one could see. Her shoulders shook, and from the distance it looked like she was sobbing, defeated, broken, another casualty in a war that had already claimed too much. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A spotlight swept over her briefly, before turning away, confirming what the enemy scout believed: she wasn't a threat. She's crying, he muttered into his comms, chuckling. Poor thing doesn't even know she's already dead. Then he turned his back. That was his final mistake. Because Aelin Vale wasn't crying. She was calculating kill angles. Beneath the surface of what looked like despair was something far colder, more deliberate. Her eyes weren't swimming in tears, they were scanning, measuring distance, counting steps, noting which guards had line of sight and which didn't. The tremble in her hands wasn't fear, it was focus, the kind required to hold your breath and steady a single shot. 5 armed men were moving to secure the southeast platform, 3 more circled the perimeter near the west wing. There was a blind spot between the third generator and the broken satellite tower. She could make it there in 12 seconds flat, if she moved just as the guards rounded the cargo crates. Timing would be everything. If she was even half a second late, she'd be dead. If she was early, she'd be seen. Aelin had 1 blade left, that was it. 1 blade and a stolen radio, buried beneath the mud under her knee. But what she had more than anything, more than weapons, more than allies, was knowledge. This base wasn't unfamiliar. She'd been stationed here before, back when it was a training site for Allied forces, before it was taken, before they'd turned it into a stronghold for mercenaries who didn't care about laws or loyalties. She knew its layout. She knew where the acoustic dead zones were. She knew which cameras hadn't worked since before the fall. They thought they had taken everything from her. They thought she had nothing left to fight with, but they'd forgotten that Aelin Vale didn't need an army. She was one. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her breathing slowed. She counted in reverse from 7, waiting for the thunderclap that would cover her movement. At 5, she could hear the crunch of boots just meters away. At 3, the guard commander's voice crackled over the radios, announcing a sector sweep. At 1, she moved. It was a blur, mud-slick movement, low to the ground, fast, efficient. She cut through the darkness, like a shadow reborn. In seconds, she reached the satellite tower's cover. The stolen radio was back in her grip. Static hummed softly as she twisted the dial, tuning into the enemy's comms. Their voices were clipped and casual. Relaxed. The arrogance of victors. They still thought she was broken. That belief was going to cost them everything. One of the men, Callan, judging by the way they barked his name, complained about the cold. Another joked about drawing straws to see who'd drag her body back for confirmation. She committed their voices to memory. She wanted to know the last sounds they would make. Aelin crouched lower, adjusting the strap on her torn tactical vest, fingers brushing the crude map she'd drawn into the lining during captivity. Every movement she made now was not desperation, it was part of a system she'd been building for the last 3 hours. The enemy had taken her team, her backup, and her exit route. They'd thought it would break her, instead it had distilled her. She wasn't playing their game, she was building her own. Far above, lightning carved the sky in jagged lines, throwing the compound into a strobe of white and shadow. Her reflection flashed for an instant in the shattered glass of the tower. Blood on her cheek, dirt on her collarbone, eyes like stone. She looked like a ghost, and that felt right, because from this point forward, she would be one. Not a soldier, not a prisoner. Just a phantom with unfinished business, and a memory sharper than any blade. By the time they realized she was gone from the clearing, it was already too late. One guard stumbled across a blood-stained piece of cloth where she'd been kneeling and raised the alarm, but the echo of his voice was swallowed by an explosion in the eastern wing. A generator she'd rigged earlier when they weren't paying attention. Panic erupted through the comms. Orders clashed, footsteps scattered, lights flickered, and in the chaos, they forgot the one truth they should have never overlooked. Aelin Vale wasn't outnumbered, she was in control. Every move they made was part of her calculation, and she was just getting started. 2 weeks earlier, no one in command would have guessed Aelin Vale would be the last one standing. Not because she wasn't capable, those who trained with her knew her record was clean, her reflexes elite, but because she never wanted the spotlight. She was quiet, efficient, and stayed out of the ego games that dominated the Helix unit. While the others boasted about their kill counts, or tried to outmaneuver each other for promotions, Aelin was in the training yard at dawn, perfecting corner clearance drills or timing wind shear effects on long-distance shots. When they mocked her for being too intense, too reserved, she just smiled. She didn't care about their approval, she cared about control. The Helix unit had been stationed in the remote dunes of Sela Ridge, assigned to protect a communications hub, crucial for decrypting enemy chatter. The outpost was supposed to be a formality, routine, low threat, perfect for rookies and burned-out officers. But Aelin had sensed something wrong from day one. The patrol schedules were erratic, incoming supply routes were being rerouted without explanation. And the command hierarchy had shifted too quickly, with Captain Heston taking control after a sudden reassignment of the previous CO. Heston was charming but sloppy, too political, too eager to impress superiors. He laughed off Aelin's concerns as paranoia. "You're sharp, Vale," he'd said, with a condescending grin. But try to enjoy the lull for once. The lull was an illusion. Aelin knew that kind of silence meant someone was watching. Even in the downtime, she made preparations. She memorized topography maps, walked the perimeter every evening even when it wasn't her turn, and marked pressure points in the facility that could be used defensively if needed. Her bunkmate, Reyes, used to joke that Aelin was secretly planning to take over the place. "You're too calm, Vale. It's like you already know the war's coming to our door." Aelin didn't answer, she just kept checking the emergency kits. It was on the 12th day that things unraveled. A routine delivery convoy went silent just outside the ridge. Protocol demanded an immediate scout party, but Heston delayed the response by 6 hours, claiming the terrain probably caused comms interference. Aelin requested to be part of the team when they finally deployed. She wasn't assigned, she went anyway. What they found wasn't interference. It was a massacre. The supply trucks were burning husks, personnel executed, not ambushed. It was methodical, tactical. Someone knew their movements. Someone was feeding the enemy their schedules. Aelin didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the compound came under fire. It wasn't a bombardment, it wasn't messy, it was surgical, quiet, breaches, jamming devices, comms blackout. Aelin was in the East Barracks when she saw the flash of a silenced muzzle in the hallway, and watched Reyes drop before she could reach for her weapon. It was like watching the air be sucked out of a sealed room. Chaos didn't explode, it folded in on itself. And in that silence, Aelin realized it wasn't an invasion, it was a coup. She crawled out through a maintenance duct, cutting her hand on a rusted grate, and emerged in the armory just as 2 mercenaries were loading crates. They hadn't expected survivors. She killed both without hesitation, one with a pry bar, the other with the stolen sidearm. From there she moved with cold precision, gathering what she could, mapping escape paths. The base had been compromised from the inside, and it wasn't just about resources. It was a message: someone had sold them out. Someone had fed their location to a black market military syndicate, known for harvesting combat AI cores, encrypted tech, and living assets. She watched from the rafters of the drone hangar as Captain Heston shook hands with one of the invaders. She didn't scream, she didn't shoot. She memorized the angle of his body, the weight in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked toward the command tower. That was where she'd go. Not to confront him, but to trace the data stream he was trying to wipe clean. That's when she discovered the logs, secrets tucked inside deletion folders, personnel trades, payment codes, and a list of expendable assets. Her name was second. She should have run then, escaped into the cliffs, disappeared. But she didn't, she stayed. Not out of vengeance. Out of necessity, because once you're on that kind of list, survival isn't about hiding. It's about sending a message they can't afford to ignore. So she moved. From tower to corridor, dodging patrols, planting failsafes, rerouting old tech systems. The compound had become her trap, and they didn't even realize it. They were still hunting stragglers, still thinking this was cleanup, still underestimating her. By the time night fell, and the rain began, Aylin had already sealed the inner gates, diverted power, and positioned herself exactly where she wanted to be, right where they could see her. On her knees. Shaking, waiting, because she didn't need their pity. She needed them to look away long enough for her to kill every last one of them. Long before the betrayal, before the blood and fire, Aylin Vale had been the kind of soldier people underestimated, not because she lacked strength, but because she didn't need to prove it. She never shouted in meetings, never interrupted during briefings, and rarely volunteered for the flashy assignments. She was the observer in the room, the one who noticed when the quartermaster's ledger didn't match up with actual inventory, or when a patrol route had been adjusted for no stated reason. She memorized faces, the way people walked, the time they usually visited the mess hall. Some called it paranoia. Aylin called it pattern recognition, and patterns always told the truth. Her earliest instructors at the academy marked her down as overly analytical, emotionally restrained, possibly detached. They meant it as a critique. Aylin took it as confirmation that she saw things others missed. Where some responded to chaos with adrenaline, she responded with calculation. While her peers trained reflexes, she trained control, how to steady her breathing under duress, how to read terrain in motion, how to anticipate an enemy's behavior based on slight changes in posture. She'd once scored higher on advanced predictive engagement simulations than any soldier in her class, but no one noticed that. They were too focused on the loud ones, the brawlers, the showmen, and that suited Aylin just fine. The day before the betrayal, she had stood in the command center staring at a cluster of transmission data that didn't match the signal maps. Something was being relayed outside the ridge, but it wasn't coming from the main tower. The others waved it off, citing old hardware glitches. Heston smirked and said, "You worry too much, Vale. You've got the instincts of a spook, not a soldier." She didn't respond, she just kept watching the data. She marked where the anomalies occurred, logged the times, and stored them in her encrypted drive. The signatures repeated every 6 hours, like a heartbeat. That wasn't a glitch. That was a feed. Aylin always knew war wasn't just about bullets, it was about attention, where you focused it, how long you held it, and who you let take theirs off you. That's how she'd survived her first deployment, not because she was the strongest, but because she noticed an enemy's boot print in the mud, an hour before they struck. It was never luck, it was never instinct. It was math. Now, back in the rain-soaked ruins of the overrun compound, that same mind was operating at full capacity. She was crouched beneath an old weather station, her stolen radio pressed against her ear, listening as enemy squads argued over positioning. One claimed to have seen movement by the wrecked barracks, another reported hearing breathing near the power conduit. Neither were correct. She wasn't there anymore, but she knew exactly where they were. She had clocked their response time to sector alerts, averaging 16 seconds. Their team formations weren't randomized, they followed predictable sweep patterns, always in groups of 4. They used codenames pulled from playing cards: King, Jack, Queen. Jack always talked more than the rest. Queen moved slightly slower. She stored each detail like ammunition. She noted the crackling buzz of one comm cutting out when the user passed through the east tunnel, their blind spot. That meant the tunnel still disrupted signals. Perfect, it was narrow, covered in piping, and dark enough to disappear in. Ideal for misdirection. Aylin had no delusions about what she was up against. These weren't amateurs, they were contracted professionals, equipped with surveillance drones, motion sensors, and enough weaponry to take out small cities. But they didn't have her mind, they didn't have her resolve, and they didn't know the compound the way she did. She could feel herself slipping into that hyper-focused state she'd trained for. Heart rate, steady, movements, economical, time perceived, in frames rather than seconds. It was a rhythm, a machine humming in her brain, each piece clicking into place. This was her battlefield now. Not theirs. She crawled through a maintenance shaft slick with grime, emerging near the old mech bay. From there, she moved to the fuel depot, where she'd stashed one of the last active signal disruptors earlier that day. She flipped the switch. A soft pulse spread through the air, scrambling the nearby sensors. To them, it would look like a power fluctuation, a minor glitch. Not an attack, not yet. That would come later. Back in her early training days, her instructors gave her a nickname behind her back. The ghost with the numbers. It was meant to mock how cold and calculated she seemed, as if she lacked humanity. But if they'd watched her now, navigating the ruins of her fallen base, they'd see something terrifying in that calculation. This wasn't inhumanity, it was clarity. A clarity that came when everything else had been burned away. She pressed herself against a wall, as footsteps neared, two men, chatting idly about moving the final batch of salvage to the extraction ship. One of them kicked over a metal canister, and cursed. She heard the familiar click of his rifle being adjusted. Sloppy, loud, comfortable. He thought the area was clear. That told her they hadn't found the bodies yet. Good. That meant they still didn't realize someone was hunting them. When they passed, she didn't follow immediately. She waited, counted 27 seconds. Then she moved, not after them, but ahead of them, circling through the conduit routes. Only someone who had built escape drills would know. By the time they reached the upper bay, she was already in position, watching them from a gap in the ceiling tiles. Planning, mapping. They thought she was emotional. They thought she was scattered. They didn't realize she was 3 moves ahead, already sketching the geometry of their deaths in her mind. The temperature inside the compound kept dropping, not because the weather was worsening, but because the auxiliary systems were slowly failing. Lights flickered with longer gaps between hums. Doors that once responded to clearance badges, now stayed locked in whatever position they were last forced into. It wasn't just the enemy that was unraveling the structure, it was time itself. Aylin felt the tension humming through the walls, like a living thing. This place, once rigid with protocol and order, was now bending at the edges. Breaking, like the people inside it. Including her. Her body ached, her ribs still sore, from the earlier fall into the drainage pit. Her left arm was growing stiff from the cold, and her breathing was shallower than it had been hours ago. She hadn't eaten in almost 2 days, and the bruises blooming along her back from the earlier blast were beginning to limit her motion. But none of that mattered. What mattered was how much longer she had before they stopped searching, and started locking things down. The window was closing. She crouched behind a rusted generator, reviewing her mental map of the remaining enemy sweep teams. She'd estimated 12 active mercenaries, after her last 2 kills, maybe 13, if one of the missing biosignatures had faked their death. That would explain the faulty life scan from earlier. One of them, likely their lead tech, had been smart enough to mask movement in the eastern tunnels by bouncing thermal signatures between air ducts. Aylin had caught it after noticing a heat trail that didn't align with real-world movement patterns. She adjusted her numbers. 13 targets, each moving in predictable rotations. She'd already marked 9 kill paths. The others would fall in line once the chaos started. But there was one problem she hadn't solved yet. Captain Heston. She didn't know where he was. She'd seen him during the first phase of the takeover, arms folded, talking to the invaders, like he was just one of them. He hadn't been armed. That meant he wasn't fighting, he was directing, managing something behind the scenes. Coordinating extraction, maybe. Or worse, communicating with external buyers. If he was still inside the compound, he was keeping low, avoiding the risk of getting caught in the fray. That meant he'd either fled to the comms bunker, the lower vaults, or the server core in the old AI wing. She'd rigged 2 of those places already. But if he was in the third,
She'd have to reach it before he triggered whatever failsafe he'd inevitably installed. She couldn't take any chances. The pressure built in her chest, not from fear, but from a gnawing sense of time's weight pressing against her spine. Every second she lingered was another second someone might spot a flicker in the shadows. Another second they might realize the security feed had been looped. Another second, a guard might notice their comms were off by a fraction of a frequency, because she was already jamming them on a rotating basis. The system she'd designed to keep them blind was holding, but only barely. She moved again, keeping low, sliding beneath a broken stairwell, and reaching for the bundle she'd hidden in the vent shaft. Inside, 3 makeshift flashbangs, a flare gun, and a half-charged data drive, stolen off the wrist of a dead enemy comms officer. It contained encrypted maps, chat logs, and possibly their extraction schedule. She hadn't had time to decrypt it yet. But if she could get a few minutes in the old tech bay, she could plug it into one of the ancient analysis cores that hadn't been wiped. If that drive confirmed an extraction route, especially if it led to Heston, she'd finally know where to hit hardest. She climbed through the shaft, fingers scraping against cold steel, then dropped silently into the hull behind what had once been the drone bay. It smelled like fuel, and dust and blood, 3 scents that had begun to merge in her mind as the new normal. Down the hull, she saw 2 mercs pacing, weapons loose in their hands. Casual, they thought no one had made it this far. They were wrong. She didn't engage them yet, instead she waited. She observed their rhythm. Every 4 steps, the taller one scratched the back of his neck. A nervous tick. The shorter one's hand drifted to his sidearm every time the light above them buzzed. Conditioning. Both were vulnerabilities. She memorized them, not because she needed to kill them now, but because she'd use that information later, when she needed a distraction. The hallway had a power panel behind a cracked wall. She opened it gently, rewired one of the relays to overload the light above the guards, and set a 5-second delay fuse using a snapped capacitor. Then she retreated. At the 5-second mark, the light exploded in a burst of sparks and heat. They rushed toward it. She didn't. Instead she slipped around the far side of the drone assembly room and reached the tech bay undetected. Every move bought her time. Every spark, every sound was a tool in her hands. Not chaos, not luck. Just pieces on a board. She wasn't reacting to pressure, she was orchestrating it. That's the part they never understood. They thought pressure revealed weakness, but in Aylin's case, it revealed intention. Precision. A mind that didn't break under tension, it sharpened. While others panicked, she calculated. When they rushed, she timed. When they scattered, she narrowed. In that room filled with dead machines and forgotten systems, she found a functioning terminal. She plugged in the data drive. Encryption levels flashed on the screen. It would take 2 minutes to crack it. She set 2 traps in the hallway behind her, checked the bolt on her stolen sidearm, and leaned in close to the screen. If this drive told her what she suspected, then Heston wasn't just hiding. He was preparing to vanish. And if he disappeared, none of this, none of the blood, the pain, the effort would matter. She wouldn't let that happen, not now.
The screen pulsed in soft green hues as the decryption sequence finally cracked. Aylin's eyes scanned the rapidly populating files, fingers trembling, not from fatigue or fear, but from the raw current of information flowing into her brain. The drive had been a goldmine. Extraction times, communication logs, squad assignments, even deployment shifts for the next 48 hours. But what made her freeze in place was a file labeled Transfer Manifest Package Omega. Her heart slowed. She opened it. There it was. Proof that this operation wasn't just a hit and run. It was a high-level black market extraction, and the package wasn't a crate or tech component. It was a person. Her. The file confirmed what she had suspected ever since she saw her name on that kill list in the command tower. Heston hadn't sold them all out randomly. He hadn't betrayed the Helix unit for money alone. He'd sold her specifically. Aylin Vale had been marked for handover to an unnamed buyer, an entity interested in long-term behavioral conditioning research and applied predictive modeling. That wasn't military talk. That was code for human experimentation. They hadn't come to kill her. They'd come to capture her. The attack had been tailored to overwhelm her team while keeping her alive, isolated and cornered. That explained why every squad left her an exit, why no one had gone for the kill shot, why every enemy unit up to this point had hesitated at the final moment. They thought they were hurting her. She felt the air around her go still, thick and acidic like the calm before a storm. The enemy hadn't miscalculated her location. They'd engineered it. But what Heston didn't know, what the buyer didn't anticipate, was that Aelin Vale was already aware of her role in this grand machine, and she'd already begun rewriting it. She yanked the drive from the console and moved fast, snatching 2 EMP charges from a shelf, slinging a loose satchel across her shoulder, and diving back into the hallway. The traps she'd set had been triggered. Blood stained the wall from where one of the mercs had tripped a razor line. His companion was missing, probably dragged away. No time to clean, no need for subtlety anymore. They'd start adapting now, reacting. Good, that was the plan. Every great trap required a setup, and Aelin had just found hers. The map files revealed a half-forgotten access tunnel below the server core, built during the original phase of the compound's construction. A ventilation shaft that led not to the exterior, but to a dead zone beneath the east runway. It wasn't on any of the modern schematics, but Aelin had trained here before the upgrades. She knew it existed, and more importantly, she knew it hadn't been sealed because she'd used it once during a blackout drill to bypass a lockdown. She hadn't thought about it in years. Now it was her key to re-enter the heart of the operation undetected. She moved quickly, slipping past 2 patrols, using vents and crawl spaces. Only someone who'd practically lived in the facility could navigate. Every corner turned was another memory weaponized. A fallen pipe, a broken screen. She knew where the lights flickered too fast, where sound carried too far. She adjusted her footsteps accordingly, becoming the ghost they feared, one that didn't exist in their files. As she entered the sub-level maintenance shaft, she finally allowed herself a moment to plan the real kill zone. She couldn't just fight her way out. They'd expect that now. Too many had died for them to take her lightly anymore. No, now they'd go full lockdown. They'd surround the command wing with their best, expecting her to attack head-on, to make a last desperate run for glory. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She would collapse the entire wing on top of them. The pressure locks still worked, the fire suppression system was active, and the emergency reactor on sub-level B was dangerously unstable. If she triggered the right sequence, leaking fuel, delaying suppression, and manually locking the blast doors behind them, she could turn their safe zone into a furnace. Not instantly, not explosively, but slowly. Enough time for panic to set in. Enough time for them to realize what she'd done. She climbed up the rusted rungs, slipping into the tunnel behind the east runway. Dust filled her lungs. The air was thin. The shaft was so narrow she had to crawl for meters, using only muscle memory and blind reach to find her path forward. Aelin didn't stop. Even as the metal bit into her skin, even as the dark pressed in around her like a tomb, she moved. This was what she'd been made for, not through ideology, through experience. Survival wasn't a story of luck. It was math, muscle, and merciless decisions. When she emerged in the dark underpass of the command sector, she immediately went to work. She planted 2 EMPs under the corridor junction, wired them to a fail-safe trigger in her vest pocket, and rerouted a coolant leak toward the door seal. Once the heat sensors detected irregularity, the system would begin redirecting power to that sector, opening paths elsewhere, and drawing the enemy straight into the furnace. Then she found the central panel, the one they'd all retreat to if things went bad. She placed her final charge there. This wasn't just a counter-strike anymore. This was a setup, one so elegant it would look like coincidence, until the final moment. By the time they realized none of it was random, that every hallway they chose, every retreat they made, every decision they thought they controlled, was designed by her, it would already be over. They'd think it was luck. That's how it always went when someone underestimated the quiet one. She should have known the betrayal was coming. In hindsight, the signs weren't subtle. They were loud, blaring, and obvious. Once you stopped giving people the benefit of the doubt. Captain Heston had never cared about loyalty. He cared about power. But Aylin, for all her calculation and war-hardened judgment, had made the mistake of assuming that Heston, despite his arrogance, would never go this far. Not him, not the man who'd pinned medals on her chest 2 years ago. Not the one who stood beside her when Reyes was nearly lost on that ice mission up north. Not the one who used to call her the backbone of Helix in front of the entire unit. But that was the illusion. He wasn't a commander, he was a dealer. And she had been the highest value piece on his board. The betrayal hadn't started with a bullet or an explosion. It began with a shift in tone, a pattern of reassignments, a rotation of new faces, mercs disguised as support staff, technicians who didn't log their equipment, late-night conversations between Heston and unnamed contacts that were scrubbed from official recordings but still whispered through the walls of the command deck. Aylin had sensed something off, but there was no hard proof, just instincts. And instincts in a military hierarchy were easy to dismiss. She confronted him only once. It had been 3 days before the base fell. She stood in his office after hours, silent as always, and laid out her concerns with surgical precision. There's movement in the satellite logs, unauthorized communications, 4 supply deliveries marked as confirmed, but never arrived. Sir, someone's rerouting our infrastructure. Heston leaned back in his chair and sighed like a parent humoring a child. Vale, you need to ease off the throttle. This isn't a battlefield, it's a listening post. These aren't enemies, they're contractors. She remembered the smug way he sipped his coffee, how he didn't even stand up to address her. You've been through hell, I get it, but the war's changing. We're not the front line anymore. We're assets, information, technology, and you're valuable. But that only matters if you don't turn yourself into a liability. That word, liability. She hadn't flinched then. She thanked him. She walked out. But she knew from that moment on she was being measured, not respected. When the first wave hit the base, he didn't even sound surprised. While the sirens screamed and the corridors filled with smoke and chaos, Heston's voice over the comms remained calm, calculated, too rehearsed. All units to your designated stations. Protocol Echo 4. But Echo 4 wasn't a standard code, not for a Helix unit. It was one of the emergency failsafes used in off-grid shadow programs only senior command officers were even aware of. Aylin had read the decrypted brief once during a system audit. It was a wipe and sell order. By the time she reached the command deck, Heston was gone. No fight, no orders, no fallback plan. He had vanished while people died trying to hold the perimeter. She'd found his office empty, drawers ripped out, hard drives missing. But what he left behind told her everything she needed to know. A locked case in the floor, hidden beneath false paneling. Inside were 3 things: an extraction badge from a syndicate transport network, a folder containing her service profile, with annotated modifications, and a half-burned datapad listing 5 names. Hers was first. The rest were crossed out. She wasn't just being sold. She was the last one left on a delivery list. It wasn't about silencing Helix. It was about securing her and removing all other witnesses. Reyes, Lorne, Cho, Bren, even Jax, the field medic who once carried her through a mortar zone with a busted leg. They were all part of the unit, all erased. And she understood now why the attack had felt too clean, too surgical. It had been modeled after her own tactics. The enemy wasn't mimicking her. They had been using her file, her habits, her protocols. Heston had sold not just her life, but her mind. Her entire operational pattern had been turned against her. And that burned deeper than any wound. She knelt by the empty case, hands clenched tight, jaw locked. This wasn't just a coup. This was erasure. Every memory she had of Helix, every bond, every scar earned alongside soldiers who'd bled for each other. It was all a ledger to Heston. Just numbers and zeros in a deal that would make him disappear into the shadows with a new identity, a fat payout, and a smirk on his face. But he'd miscalculated one thing. Aylin wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting to make sure he didn't survive. She took what was left in the hidden compartment, a classified black key, once used for EI shutdowns. It wasn't just a relic, it was access. With it she could override nearly every security wall on the compound, shut doors, reroute systems,
even trigger the failsafe Heston believed was hidden too deep to reach. He'd set the game board thinking she wouldn't live long enough to understand it. She was about to flip it upside down. As she moved through the dark corridors again, this time heading toward the substation beneath the AI core, she felt a clarity settle into her bones. There was no doubt anymore, no hesitation. The betrayal had completed something inside her, not broken her, refined her. All that remained now was a singular outcome: Heston dead. His operation burned, and her standing over the ashes, not for revenge, for correction. He'd tried to erase her, but ghosts don't vanish when you forget them. They come back when you least expect them, quiet, calculating, and lethal. The silence after betrayal doesn't come with peace, it comes with weight. And Aelin Vale felt every ounce of it as she crawled through the spine of the compound's underbelly, past the humming generators and rusted cables, surrounded by the echoes of her former life. Above her, the facility pulsed with activity, enemy chatter moving through comms, boots patrolling the upper decks, flickers of infrared laser traps now armed and active. They thought she was cornered. Worse, they thought she was broken. Because the last drone footage they'd caught of her showed her huddled in the corner of a maintenance hall, eyes glassy, shoulders shaking, crying, or so it seemed. They didn't realize she was measuring echo angles in her head, that every breath was timed between bursts of static, that every sob was cover for her listening, tracking movement, triangulating positions, syncing internal timers to the rhythm of their footfalls, that she had re-entered the kill state. The one she never advertised. The one Helix only ever glimpsed when she was forced into a corner. But before she could strike, she had to convince them she was done, defeated. So she gave them a gift. A calculated stumble near the lower barracks corridor. A dropped satchel. A blood smear on the floor. They'd find it, of course. It would trigger exactly what she wanted. An assumption that she was injured, disoriented, maybe even near death. She didn't need them relaxed, just sloppy, and even trained mercenaries got sloppy when they thought their prey was already dying. She retreated deeper into the lower levels, into sectors most of them had never seen. Old water filtration zones, rusted-out AI testing chambers, forgotten maintenance closets thick with dust and mold. The maps they carried didn't cover this part, and that meant they'd have to move blind, which was exactly what she needed. Still, even with her plan sharpening by the hour, Aelin couldn't ignore the wear on her body. She was running low on energy stims. The shrapnel near her left rib hadn't stopped bleeding, though she'd packed it tightly with an old med wrap. Her vision blurred sometimes, especially after a sprint. She hadn't eaten in 18 hours, but hunger and exhaustion didn't matter. She was running on something stronger than adrenaline. She was running on pure intent. And intent could make you look like you were faltering, even when every step was a calculation. In the depths of the South Maintenance Wing, she triggered the backup cameras, not to surveil the enemy, but to let them surveil her. She let them catch glimpses, just flashes, a shoulder slipping around a corner, a flicker of her shadow as she passed a doorway. The sound of labored breathing piped through the old comms, like a ghost bleeding through the static. They bought it. One team peeled off, then another, hunting her with greed in their hearts. She could hear it in their movement, less formation, more speed. They were splitting up, hoping one of them would be the one to bring her in. Not kill her, bring her in, alive. That more than anything, confirmed the truth she'd found in the file. She wasn't just a loose end to be eliminated. She was property to be recovered. The notion disgusted her, but she would use it. Use them. 3 minutes after the second squad split from the main team, she engaged the furnace trap. It was subtle at first, just a vent reroute, and a temperature shift. Then, as the heat sensors in the upper decks began to climb, she set the corridor pressure to lock on a delay. The squads still upstairs would be bottlenecked. The ones below would be cut off, and the ones chasing her would soon learn what happens when you mistake quiet for weakness. The first ambush came in a utility shaft near Sector D12. Aelin had looped a length of high-tension wire around an exposed pipe, coated it in grease, and laid it just beyond the corner of a half-open blast door. The merc stepped into it with full confidence, until his foot went out from under him, sending him slamming into the pipe, snapping his neck with a clean crack. She didn't even pause to look back, just moved to the next shadow. The second one wasn't so lucky. He spotted her as she exited the coolant chamber, and shouted, raising his rifle. But he didn't notice the flickering panel she had left, blinking 3 minutes earlier. It detonated in a short compressed burst of electromagnetic force, frying his gear and blowing him off balance. She was on him before he hit the floor, driving a carbon blade through his neck in a silent plunge that ended him instantly. Each encounter looked like desperation, but each was part of a larger map, a system. And in that system, her apparent defeat was nothing but a carefully constructed illusion. Even the footage they were collecting, she made sure of it, told a story. One of fatigue, of erratic movement, of random choices. But behind every hallway she entered, every doorway she bypassed, every body she left behind, was a line, a trajectory, an angle. She wasn't crying, she was calculating, and the numbers were adding up. They thought they had her cornered, but the trap was never for her. It was for the ones who mistook her stillness for surrender. And soon, when she sealed the final door behind them, and flipped the kill circuit, they'd finally understand what looked like defeat had always been design. In the silence between attacks, Aylin stood in a chamber she hadn't entered in over 3 years, the cryo relay annex. It was abandoned now, long decommissioned after the Central Helix AI deemed its subroutines obsolete. The wiring still hummed faintly though, and frost shimmered on the walls like a memory. This place had once been her testing ground. Before they threw her into the field. Before she became a ghost with a rifle. Back then, it was just her, a deck of sim scenarios, and the instructor who never called her by name, only designation, Wraith Prototype, 7. She never told anyone she came from the Wraith program, not even Reyes. The files were sealed under layers of redaction, buried in Helix's darker archives. What they all knew was that she was fast, precise, and unshakable. What they didn't know was why. It wasn't training alone, it was evolution, molded by science and necessity. Aylin had undergone experimental neural encoding, designed to enhance strategic prediction. In simple terms, her brain had been rewired to model conflict, hundreds of steps ahead, not in seconds, but in heartbeats. The results had been unpredictable. On others the encoding failed, resulting in seizures, cognitive collapse, even death. But on her, it had clicked. She didn't just react, she anticipated, watched angles unfold like branches, simulated kill zones before anyone even fired a shot. It was this power that made her a legend among operators, and a liability to command. That kind of capability was too dangerous to keep unsupervised. So they buried the past, rewrote her file, and sent her to Helix as just another elite with a perfect record, and no family. She kept the secret because power is safest when it's underestimated. Until now. She stood still in the cold, breathing slow, watching the frozen glass reflect a woman even she barely recognized anymore. Not broken, not burned out, just sharpened to a knife's edge. Her eyes scanned the curved ceiling, the frost-crusted panels, the remains of test rigs still dangling from the walls. She approached the old console, tapped in the master override code still etched into her memory, and waited. The chamber lights flickered once, then twice, and then, the system came online, not fully, but just enough for her to access the dormant sequence labeled Spectre protocols. No one was supposed to know they still existed, but she had kept the ghost key, the single subroutine code that unlocked them all. Spectre protocols weren't just defensive tactics, they were environmental dominations, tools that could override architectural safety measures, reroute power loops, create illusions inside infrastructure. Designed to be used in battlefield simulations, they could turn a static building into a war trap. And tonight, that's exactly what she needed. She initiated Phase 1 optical decoy mapping. Within minutes, holographic signatures of her image would appear on multiple surveillance feeds, some walking, some crawling, some slumped against walls, bleeding. To the enemy's network, it would look like she was everywhere, and nowhere all at once. Chaos would spread, doubt would bloom. Next, she activated Phase 2, Echo Displacement. The base's audio systems, long dormant, sprang to life with misdirected sounds, footsteps in sealed corridors, heavy breathing where no one stood, alerts in dead sectors. It would stretch their teams thin, force them to investigate ghosts, waste time, burn energy. Then she paused. Phase 3 was more dangerous. It would reroute coolant lines into the ammunition storage decks, force a controlled shutdown. Risky, but if timed right, it would leave them with no resupply points. Their weapons would run dry, while she still had scavenged blades, pressure mines, and stealth gear from fallen operators. She weighed the risk, and then confirmed activation. The system warned her of potential casualties. She pressed forward anyway. This wasn't survival anymore. This was reclamation. As the Spectre protocols executed, she left the cryo annex and moved with precision through the subdeck maintenance shafts. She passed signs of her earlier movements, smears of blood, dragged bodies, a discarded comm unit with its casing pried open. Each one a breadcrumb she deliberately left. But from this point forward, she wouldn't need deception. They would deceive themselves. The system she'd awakened would make sure of that. And yet, deep down, Aylin knew the Spectre protocols were more than a strategic tool. They were a mirror, a reflection of the woman she'd become. Because this power, the predictive mind, the flawless traps, the ability to vanish into shadow, it had always been inside her. The program didn't create it. It only gave her permission to use it. Now she didn't need permission anymore. She emerged from the maintenance shaft into a ventilation corridor, overlooking the comm tower atrium. Below her, 5 enemy operators moved in slow formation, scanning the walls, muttering through garbled comms. Target moved southeast, no west. She's bleeding out. Confirmed echo in hallway 4. They were responding exactly as planned, running simulations in their heads that didn't match reality, reacting to phantoms. She waited. One stepped beneath the grid vent. She released the latch. He dropped like a rag doll. His neck snapped by impact. The others panicked, opened fire on empty air. Their bullets clanged off metal and scattered sparks into the dark. She dropped another from the shadows with a silenced shot. A third tripped over the corpse and fired blindly, hitting his comrade. Within seconds, the scene devolved into a mess of noise, confusion, and retreat. This was the power she had hidden, not a weapon, an entire battlefield, folded inside her mind. And now it was awake.
The compound was starting to feel like a sinking ship, not because of any structural failure, but because of the growing panic in the men inside it. What had begun as a controlled containment mission had now unraveled into something none of them were trained to handle. The reports were contradictory. The kills were clean. The movements didn't match one body. Every corridor became suspect. Every camera feed seemed manipulated. Some began to whisper what they refused to say over comms, that she wasn't human anymore, that something had been done to her, something that made her unstoppable. They were right, just not in the way they feared. Aylin moved through the shadows like she had lived in them all her life, and in truth she had, born in the outer-tier cities, raised by silence and strategy, drafted into war before she even learned to dream. Helix didn't make her what she was. It only gave her tools to refine it. She was the product of a world that punished softness and rewarded precision. And now precision was all she needed. The Spectre protocols were doing their job. Every squad now operated as if they were navigating a haunted maze. She knew the signs: sweat building under armor, commands delivered with edge, formation drift creeping into their movement. Worse, they'd lost centralized comms. Her earlier pulse burst had fried their signal repeaters, isolating squads from one another. They couldn't even confirm who was still alive. That isolation would kill them faster than any bullet. Aylin had eyes on all of it. She watched from a concealed perch in the ventilation frame above Sector 9's loading bay as another squad passed below her. This group moved slower, more carefully. Veterans, maybe, The way they checked corners, how they kept each other in line of sight, suggested they hadn't fallen entirely into panic. But even they showed signs. They scanned the same hallway twice, hesitated before passing a cross-section, whispered instead of signaling. She dropped behind them silently. Two went down before the others even realized they weren't alone. The third turned and caught a glimpse of her just before the flash mine went off, searing light into his vision. He fired instinctively, but she was already behind him, sliding the blade between his ribs and guiding him gently to the floor. The last turned and ran. She didn't chase, she let him go. Let him report, because terror is most effective when it spreads. The man would bring news to whatever remnants of command still existed. He'd describe her eyes, calm, unflinching, empty of mercy. He'd describe the traps that felt like magic, the shadows that seemed to move, and he would beg them to reconsider. But they wouldn't. Helix never retreated. That was their flaw. They would pour more bodies into the compound, send waves until she broke. But they didn't understand the equation. Aylin wasn't defending a position, she was reshaping a war. Elsewhere in the compound, the power grid groaned. She'd routed an overload to the secondary generators, forcing emergency lighting into flicker mode. It cast everything in pulsing red and shadow, disorienting the operators, rendering their HUDs less reliable. Most didn't know how to fight without full vision. They'd grown up on tech crutches, relying on indicators and AI mapping. But Aylin, she didn't need sight, she needed sound. Movement. Timing, everything else was noise. She entered the central fabrication corridor through a maintenance chute and found 3 more downed operators, choked by gas, their masks torn off. One of them had clawed at the wall as they died. She recognized the insignia. These were specialists, probably brought in to counter her tactics. Trained to hunt elite operatives gone rogue. They hadn't lasted an hour. She scavenged their gear, another set of magazines, a pressure knife, a short-range jamming device, and kept moving. She didn't linger. Time wasn't her enemy, but complacency was. The longer they had to regroup, the more dangerous they'd become. She had to keep them fractured, keep the pressure constant. She reached the eastern comm tower just as the perimeter alert sounded. Reinforcements, another dropship was coming. She watched from the broken tower's side panel as the vessel descended, a sleek Vanta-class insertion craft, bearing Helix's black-on-steel logo. It touched down with calculated precision. Doors opened, a new squad emerged, 8, maybe 9. Not like the others. Heavier armor, cleaner movement. No hesitation. Aylin squinted, commandos. They had finally sent their elite. She smiled. Because this was the final stage. These weren't hunters, these were cleaners. Their job wasn't to subdue, it was to erase. And that meant Helix was done pretending. Good, so was she. She rigged the comm tower to detonate on proximity delay. Not to kill the new arrivals, it wouldn't be enough, but to blind their sensors, force them to operate without drone support. Then she pulled back toward the old storage wing, where she'd laid the last of her traps. As she moved, she marked every corridor they'd likely travel, calculated every movement angle. She wasn't just planning an ambush, she was orchestrating a symphony of destruction. By the time they realized the traps weren't random, by the time they understood they were being led, it would already be too late. They should have run. But they stayed, because Helix always believed they could crush anything they built. They forgot that when you forge a weapon too sharp, sometimes it cuts the hand that holds it. And Aylin Vale had never been theirs to wield. They had studied her profile, or at least the version of it they were allowed to see. They had run simulations, practiced room entries, rehearsed coordinated strikes. They had watched the same grainy footage that painted her as a rogue asset with a high kill count, but a tendency to vanish. What they didn't understand was that everything they knew about Aylin Vale was a carefully constructed fiction, planted in the database, not to inform them, but to mislead them. The real Aylin was a ghost no one had fully mapped, because those who tried never lived to finish the report. And yet here they were, stepping into her crucible with confidence. The commandos moved like a single unit, all precision and silence, their weapons up, their infrared vision scanning through smoke. But it didn't matter how fast they were, or how clean their formation was. Aylin didn't fight where they could see her. She fought in the places in between, behind timing, beneath noise, between certainty and doubt. She didn't need to match their strength. She needed them to believe they had already won. Then she'd take that belief and turn it into a weapon. The first trap was subtle, a vibration-activated flash mine placed behind a faux bulkhead seam. When they triggered it, it didn't blind them completely, but just enough to disrupt their sync. Two turned their heads, one paused too long. The others adjusted. That was all she needed. She struck like thunder in a vacuum. The first went down with a shot to the throat, suppressed and silent. The second reached to return fire but caught a blade to the shoulder before he could aim. She vanished before the third could swing around, melting into shadow as they shouted and spread out, cornered in a corridor built to echo sound in 10 directions at once. Flank sweep, 10-meter spread. Go low, barked one of them. Smart, but too late. She wasn't flanking, she was above. Her footfalls didn't make noise on the pipe she'd crawled across, but the wire she dropped did, hitting the floor with a metallic rattle right behind one commando. He spun, fired, and hit nothing. That second of misfire cost them 2 more lives. She was already behind the fourth, when he went down. The fifth hesitated. He didn't die in hesitation, but he marked himself for it. She saw it in the way his fingers twitched, the way his jaw clenched. He was beginning to question the plan. By the time their numbers had halved, the ones who were left were no longer confident. They were afraid. They started to realize this wasn't just a mission, this was a punishment. Because Aylin didn't just want to escape. She wanted them to understand that every order they followed had been based on arrogance. That every man who died in these halls died because someone in a boardroom decided she could be eliminated like a glitch in code. That the moment they looked at her tears and saw weakness instead of calculation, they had signed their own death warrants. She reached the upper walkway above the East Power Hub, where she had the perfect vantage point. Below her, one of the surviving commandos was trying to patch into a backup line to get external comms. He was disciplined, fingers steady, even while the others were dying, probably their tech expert. She admired that. Then she dropped a charged coil onto the console he was using. It fried instantly, and so did his last hope of calling for help. He turned, raising his weapon, but didn't fire. Aylin, he said, voice clear, calm, professional. We don't have to keep doing this. You were one of us. She stared at him. That's the problem, she replied. Then she shot him. Her voice, steady and cold, had carried through the hallway. Not loud, but just enough to ensure that the last of the team heard it. Let them know she was still close. Still listening, because now it wasn't about survival anymore. It was about message. She moved into the central sector, stepping through blood-slick corridors and the wreckage of Helix arrogance. She could see the system collapse beginning. The AI had gone into defensive lockdown, which meant the base's own automation was turning against its protocols. Drones stopped responding to operator commands. Elevators locked, doors misfired. The environment was collapsing into entropy, just like the soldiers inside it. All according to plan. Back in the command center, the final 2 commandos had hunkered down, holding the last strongpoint left in the entire facility. They'd barricaded themselves in, knowing it wouldn't hold, but trying anyway. She watched them from the exterior cam feed, 2 men, armored, breathing hard, guns trembling slightly in their hands. They weren't broken, not yet, but they were close. She patched into their frequency. You came here to erase me, she said through the comm. One of them stiffened, the other muttered, how the hell is she on this channel? You were never briefed properly, she continued. You thought this was containment, that I'd snap eventually, that I was the threat. She let silence stretch, then finished, but I was never the malfunction, I was the fail-safe. The lights flickered, and with a hiss of steam, the chamber door began to unseal. Their guns rose. She stepped inside,
and the last illusion fell away. She wasn't a ghost, she was the reckoning. The room reeked of tension, not sweat or blood or smoke, though those were present too, but pure, distilled fear. The kind that settles in the marrow when a soldier realizes that everything they've trained for, every scenario they've drilled, doesn't apply anymore. The two Helix commandos inside the command center gripped their rifles tighter as the chamber door fully hissed open, revealing nothing but steam and shadow beyond it. And then she stepped through. Aylin Vale didn't come in guns blazing or sprinting with rage. No. She walked. Slowly. Calmly. Purpose in every stride. Her boots echoed against the metal floor like the ticking of a bomb they had no way to defuse. Her eyes, dark and unflinching, scanned the room without fear. She wasn't looking for targets. She was confirming what she already knew, only two left. The last of the elite unit, and still they pointed their weapons at her, refusing to lower them even though their hands trembled and their breathing had turned sharp and uneven. "Don't move." One of them barked, trying to muster command authority. His voice cracked at the end. She stopped 5 feet from them, close enough that the flickering emergency light could reveal the state she was in. Blood-smeared armor, cuts across her cheek and forearm, one sleeve torn. But she stood like none of it mattered. As if pain was a concept she no longer recognized. "You're surrounded," the second commando lied, stepping slightly to the left, trying to flank. "If you kill us, the next wave will bury you." Helix doesn't stop. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying an insect that didn't know it was already dying. "You think I don't know what happens next?" she asked, voice cold but steady. "You think I didn't plan for every contingency before this night even started?" They hesitated. She raised one hand slowly, then tossed something onto the floor between them. A data drive. The lead commando's eyes flicked down to it, then back to her. "That's your entire operation," she said. "Every failed experiment. Every wiped file, every lie Helix told the world. Including the ones they told you." The commando stepped forward, cautiously, scooping up the device and slotting it into a portable reader. His brows furrowed as lines of classified data scrolled rapidly down the screen. His partner glanced at him, confused. "What is it?" His mouth opened slightly, then shut again. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "She's not the only one, there were dozens, no, hundreds. Failed augmentations, buried trials. Civilian test groups." Aylin didn't smile, she didn't need to. "This was never about me going rogue," she said. "It was about me surviving what no one else did. And that terrified them, not because I was dangerous, but because I could speak." They stood frozen, the illusion of their mission, their orders was disintegrating in real time. The purpose behind their deployment wasn't to neutralize a threat. It was to ensure silence. The second commando lowered his rifle slowly, uncertainty etched across his face. "You could have escaped," he said, eyes narrowing. "Why come back here? Why fight this hard?" Aylin stepped forward one more pace. "Because if I ran, they'd just do it again. Somewhere else. To someone else. I wasn't created to serve Helix. I was created to end it." The lead commando clenched his jaw. "You're asking us to turn on our own people." "No," she said. "I'm asking you to finally see who your people really are." They stood in silence, the only sound the low rumble of distant machinery winding down. Helix's systems were failing, the base was moments from total collapse. Aylin turned and walked to the main console, her fingers flying over the panel. She didn't need to explain what she was doing, they'd figure it out soon enough. "You still have time to get out," she said. "There's an evac tunnel beneath this room, manual release only. It won't show up on your schematics." The younger commando, he couldn't have been more than 24, took a step back, torn between the instinct to survive and the gut-twisting horror of everything he now understood. The older one looked at her. "You're not coming." She didn't turn around. "I'm not done." It was the truth. Because the reckoning wasn't just about exposing Helix. It was about making sure no one could ever rebuild it. As the two commandos hesitated one final time, she glanced back. If you want redemption, don't die here. Live long enough to tell someone the truth. They didn't respond, but a minute later, the floor hatch opened, and she heard the clang of boots on the tunnel ladder. She allowed herself a single breath of quiet. Then she turned back to the console. The system was riddled with override protocols, but she had spent weeks memorizing them. She bypassed the firewalls with brutal efficiency, unlocking every hidden file, every server log, every neural link record tied to the Spectre project. One by one, she uploaded them to an encrypted relay that would scatter the truth across the network, thousands of data drops set to activate if her signal ever ceased. It was her final safeguard. Not for herself. For every name Helix had erased. The red warning lights overhead began flashing faster. Structural collapse imminent. Reactor destabilization in progress. Good. It meant she was nearly finished. As the console sparked and overloaded, she walked out of the command center, down the ruined hallway, and into the heart of the compound. Bodies lay silent. Walls scorched, smoke trailing from the vents. But her steps didn't falter. She wasn't escaping. She was completing the circle. Because reckoning wasn't a single event. It was a storm, slow, inevitable, and unstoppable. And Alan Vale had become its eye. Alarms wailed through the dying veins of the Helix facility, like a chorus of mechanical panic. Lights flickered in spasms as if the base itself was choking on its final breath. The main reactor core, a synthetic heart built to power decades of clandestine operations, was now trembling under the weight of its own instability. And Alan Vale walked toward it. Not away. The air grew hotter with each level she descended. Not from flames, but from energy, raw, unstable, barely contained beneath containment shields that were cracking one panel at a time. The detonation wasn't imminent, not yet, but the chain reaction had begun, and once it crossed a certain threshold, nothing could reverse it. That was what she was counting on. As she moved, her HUD glitched and flickered from the electromagnetic surges. Her augmented systems were running blind now. No tactical overlays, no vitals, no trajectory guidance, just her instincts and her mind. But that was how she preferred it. The implants had never made her powerful. They were merely tools. What gave her the edge was what the engineers couldn't replicate: clarity under fire, the ability to plan 6 moves ahead, and the willingness to bleed if it meant winning the war. She passed the ruined laboratories of Sector 4, the birthplace of the failed Spectre iterations. Glass tanks lay shattered, fluid still congealed on the floor. She didn't look at the corpses. She had already memorized their faces from the archived files. Subject 09, Subject 12, Subject 21. They hadn't just died, they had been disposed of. Collateral in a pursuit for the perfect weapon. She wasn't here to mourn them. She was here to finish what they never got the chance to start. Down the final corridor, 2 automated defense turrets remained online, scanning the hall with erratic movements. She could have gone around them through a vent shaft, but time was no longer a luxury. Instead, she ran straight into their sightlines. The moment they swiveled to target her, she dove into a roll, slid beneath the arc of fire, and launched a micro-grenade from her belt. The explosion was contained but lethal, precision engineered to disable without setting off chain detonations. The corridor fell silent again, shrouded in smoke. Behind the ruined bulkhead lay the primary reactor chamber. The massive core pulsed in the center, surrounded by coolant tubes and decaying regulation systems. Sparks fell like rain from fractured ceiling panels. A steady hum vibrated through the floor, low, angry, unstable. The AI system, once in charge of this facility's safety, had long since surrendered to chaos. What remained was a timer with no pause button. Aylin approached the control terminal at the base of the reactor. She slotted in the second of her data drives, not just to destabilize, but to redirect. This wouldn't be a random explosion. She was shaping the collapse, directing the force inward, toward the vaults where Helix had stored its darkest technology. Neural override tech, biometric rewrite engines, psychotropic memory splicing, all destroyed in one calculated implosion. As the data drive uploaded its final sequence, a voice crackled through the nearby speaker, unexpected and brittle. Alan Vale, you've gone too far. She froze, turning toward the sound. It was him. Dr. Elias Markov, the architect of the Spectre program. She didn't know he was still alive. I knew you'd come back here, he said. You always were sentimental beneath the fire. You're not dead, she said calmly. Shame, that would have saved time. He laughed, a thin wheezing sound that barely counted as humor. I'm not in the facility, don't flatter yourself. I'm watching from a secure site, watching you destroy everything that made you. You made corpses, she spat. I made this choice. You think you're doing something noble. His voice turned cruel, twisted. You're ending a future humanity desperately needs. You are the next step. The bridge between human frailty and artificial evolution. Without you, there is no victory. She walked toward the speaker, now cracked and sparking. There's no victory in slavery, she said. And I'd rather die human than live as your weapon. He paused, then in a colder tone, the moment you entered that chamber, you wrote your own ending. Not mine, she said, pulling the final lever on the control board. Yours. The countdown began on the overhead screen. 12 minutes to core implosion. Markov cursed. You think this is the end? Helix has roots everywhere. You can't stop us all. Aylin looked up at the console, then back at the wreckage of the lab around her. I don't need to stop all of you, just enough to make the rest afraid. Then she pulled her blade and stabbed the speaker panel, ending the transmission with a final crackle. She walked toward the exit tunnel, on the far side of the chamber, one she'd pre-mapped weeks before this operation began. It wasn't designed for personnel, but for waste disposal, which meant no one would be monitoring it now. She had exactly 11 minutes and 30 seconds to clear the blast radius. That wasn't a lot of time, but it was enough. It had to be. Her feet pounded the graded steps of the tunnel ladder, as steam hissed around her. She reached the first junction, bypassed a melted security door, with a manual override, then kept moving, lungs burning from the reactor heat. This was the final stretch. She didn't think about survival. She thought about legacy. The names of the dead echoed in her mind, every failed subject, every erased whistleblower, every innocent caught in Helix's net. She wasn't just their revenge, she was their voice, and in 11 minutes, the world would hear them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.